Hello, friends. Welcome to English Minds. Today we begin part 1 of our 500 most important questions on William Wordsworth. A must for TGT, PGT, UGC NET, and other state level all competitive exams. In this part 1, we will cover his life, major works, and poetic visions. Everything you need to build a solid foundation. So stay focused, take notes, and let's dive into the world of Wordsworth. Let's get started. Our very first question: when was William Wordsworth born? Option B 1770. William Wordsworth was born on April 7, 1717 in Cockermouth, Cumberland, England. Part of this region in northwestern England known as the Lake District. In which town was Wordsworth born? Option B Cockermouth. In 7th April. What was the name of Wordsworth's father? Option A John Wordsworth. John Wordsworth was a lawyer and served as a legal agent for Sir James Lowther. Afterwards, the first Earl of Lancashire. His mother name was Anne Coxon. Which university did Wordsworth attend? Option A Cambridge. He studied at St. John's College, Cambridge. St. John's College, Cambridge, from 1787 to 1791. Who was Wordsworth's close poet friend, famous for the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner? Option C Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Coleridge and Wordsworth were close friends and collaborated on lyrical ballads. In which year did Wordsworth undertake his tour of France and the Alps? Option B 1790. He traveled to France at the Alps during the summer of 1790, experiencing the early enthusiasm of the French Revolution. French Revolution. What was the name of Wordsworth's sister Dorothy? Also a poet and diarist. Option A Dorothy Wordsworth. Dorothy Wordsworth was a writer and diarist closely associated with William's poetic inspiration, which war disrupted Wordsworth's early idealism about the French Revolution. Option A. Napoleonic War. Wordsworth initially supported the French Revolution, but the rise of Napoleon and the war with Britain disillusioned him. Wordsworth's love affair in France resulted in a daughter. What was her name? Option B. Caroline. Wordsworth had a daughter, Caroline, with Anette Vallon. Anette Vallon, a French woman he met during his stay in France. In which year did Wordsworth marry Mary Hutchinson? Option B. 1802. He married Mary Hutchinson on 4 October 1802. She was his childhood friend. What is considered Wordsworth's most famous collaboration with Coleridge? Option A. Lyrical Ballads. Lyrical Ballads 1798 was a revolutionary poetry collection that marked the beginning of the Romantic age in English literature. Compiled of 23 books, 19 by Wordsworth, 4 books by Coleridge. The Rime of Ancient Mariner, I think, first book and last Wordsworth. Coleridge, The Rime of Ancient Mariner, and Wordsworth, Tintin Abbey, the last. In which year was Lyrical Ballad first published? Option B. 1798. The first edition of Lyrical Ballads was published in 1798 with a second edition in 1800, where Wordsworth added his famous preface. What poem of Wordsworth serves as a philosophical autobiography? Option C. The Prelude. The Prelude is an autobiographical poem tracking the growth of Wordsworth's mind as a poet. The Excursion, 9 books. In Lyrical Ballad, Wordsworth aimed to write poetry using option B, common language of men. Wordsworth believed that poetry should be written in the language of ordinary people rather than elaborate poetic diction. What phrase best describes Wordsworth's definition of poetry? Option A, the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. This definition appears in the preface to Lyrical Ballads. Preface to Lyrical Ballads in 1800. emphasizing emotions and nature. Tintin Abbey written in which verse from? Option B blank verse. Lines composed a few miles above Tintin Abbey in is written in blank verse which is unrhymed iambic pentameter. What is the subtitle of the prelude? Option B Growth of a Poet Minds. The full title of the prelude or the growth of a poet's mind, highlighting its autobiographical nature. In which year was the prelude published posthumously? Option C 1850. The prelude was published in 1850, shortly after Wordsworth's death by his wife Mary Wordsworth. What is the central theme of Wordsworth's Ode Intimations of Immortality? Option B The Loss of Childhood Innocence. The poem reflects on the fading of childhood divine vision and the nostalgia of lost innocence. Wordsworth's Lucy poems are primarily about option B a young woman untimely death. The Lucy poem mourns a mysterious Lucy, a young girl who dies young. Who called Wordsworth the poet of nature? Option C. Matthew Arnold. Arnold called Wordsworth is the poet of nature, emphasizing his deep connection to the natural world. In which year was Wordsworth appointed as a poet laureate of England? Option B 1843. Wordsworth became poet laureate in 1843 after Robert Southey's death. What was Wordsworth's view on the Industrial Revolution? Option B He feared it would destroy nature. Wordsworth was critical of industrialization, believing it harmed nature and the human spirit. Which famous romantic poet criticized Wordsworth's later poetry? Option A Lord Byron. Byron criticized Wordsworth's later poetry as conservative and uninspired. Where is Wordsworth buried? Option B Grasmere Churchyard. Wordsworth death 23rd April 1850. Died of pleurisy. At the age of 80. Buried at St. Oswald Church. In Grasmere. Which of the following best describes Wordsworth's poetic style? Option B, simple and natural. Wordsworth's poetic style is known for its simplicity and natural diction, avoiding artificial poetic conventions. Wordsworth believed that poetry should be written in option B, the language of common men. In the preface of Lyrical Ballads, 18 preface of Lyrical Ballad, Wordsworth advocated for poetry written in language of ordinary people. What key concept did Wordsworth introduce in the preface to Lyrical Ballads? Option C, poetic diction should be simple. Wordsworth rejected the ornate poetic diction of earlier poets, emphasizing direct and unembellished language. Wordsworth's poetry often emphasizes option C, the beauty and power of nature. Wordsworth is famous for his beauty, nature poetry, exploring its healing and spiritual influence on humans. Which philosophy greatly influenced Wordsworth's thought? Option C, romantic idealism. Wordsworth, as a romantic poet, believed in the power of emotions, imagination, and nature. Wordsworth's poetic philosophy is often called option C, pantheism. Wordsworth's poetry reflects a belief in the divine presence in nature, aligning with pantheism. God is all in all. According to Wordsworth, what is poetry? Option a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, not things. In his preface to Lyrical Ballads, Wordsworth defined poetry as a spontaneous overflow of powerful things recollected in tranquility. In his poetry, Wordsworth often explores the contrast between option C, nature and industrialization. Wordsworth contrasts the purity of nature with the destructiveness of industrialization. What did Wordsworth believe about childhood? Option B, it is the closest to divine purity. In poems like Ode Intimations of Immortality, Wordsworth saw childhood as a time of divine closeness. Wordsworth's poetic themes often revolve around option C, the healing power of nature. Wordsworth frequently depicted nature as a source of spiritual and emotional renewal. What type of words did Wordsworth frequently use? Option B, blank verse. Wordsworth used blank verse, unrhymed, iambic pentameter, iambic pentameter extensively, especially in the prelude, 1850. Posthumously, published. Wordsworth's use of blank verse is particularly evident in option B, the prelude. Wordsworth, the prelude is a long autobiographical poem in the blank verse. Wordsworth poems often contain option B, vivid natural imagery. Wordsworth poetry is filled with rich and evocative descriptions of nature. Which poetic device is most commonly found in Wordsworth works? Option A, personification of nature. He frequently personified nature as the as seen in Tintin Abbey and Daffodils. And Daffodils. What role does memory play in Wordsworth poetry? Option B, it connects past emotions with present reflections. Wordsworth often uses memory to recall past emotions and reflect on them in the present. Wordsworth poetry is deeply influenced by option C, rural and landscapes. Wordsworth poetry is deeply rooted in rural settings, emphasizing their simplicity and purity. Wordsworth often contrasts option C, childhood innocence and adult experience. Wordsworth frequently contrasted the purity of childhood with the disillusionment of adulthood. Which poetic technique is most associated with Wordsworth philosophy and simplicity? Option B, common speech patterns. He insisted on using everyday language to make poetry accessible for ordinary peoples. Wordsworth frequently employs which literary technique in his nature poetry? Option A, apostrophe. Wordsworth often directly addressed nature or abstract concept as seen in the Tintin Abbey. What is the meter of Wordsworth Tintin Abbey? Option A, iambic pentameter. Tintin Abbey is written in unrhymed rhymed iambic pentameter blank verse. Wordsworth poetry significantly influenced which latter movement? Option C, transcendentalism. Like Emerson and Thoreau, were inspired by Wordsworth's nature philosophy. Which American writer was strongly influenced by Wordsworth? Option A, Walt Whitman. Whitman admired Wordsworth's natural themes and use of common language in poetry. Which poet called Wordsworth the poet of nature? Option A. Matthew Arnold. Wordsworth's impact on poetry is mainly seen in his option B. Advocacy for simply and poetic language. Wordsworth's influence extended to which English novelist? Option C. Thomas Hardy. Hardy themes of rural life of nature reflects Wordsworth's influence. Which latter poet rejected Wordsworth's view of nature? Option A. Lord Byron. Byron criticized Wordsworth's later poetry and rejected his reverence for nature. Wordsworth's philosophical reflections on childhood influenced which modern psychological theory? Option B. Jungian archetypes. Wordsworth's reflections on childhood and imagination influenced Carl Jung's concept of archetypes. Carl Jung. Which poet described Wordsworth's later poetry as lacking fire? Option B. Lord Byron. Byron criticized Wordsworth's later works as lacking intensity. Wordsworth's Tinted Abbey influenced which major literary works? Option A. Ralph Waldo Emerson, Nature. Emerson's transcendentalist ideas were inspired by Wordsworth's nature poetry. In which year was Wordsworth made poet laureate? Option B. 1843. Emerson's transcendentalist ideas were inspired by Wordsworth, nature of poetry. Wordsworth became poet laureate in 1843, succeeding Robert Southey. Wordsworth's poetry laid the foundation for which genre? Option B. Romantic nature poetry. Wordsworth's poetry laid the foundation of romantic nature poetry. The impact of Wordsworth's poetry is most evident in the works of option B. Robert Frost. Frost focused on nature and simplicity in poetry echoes Wordsworth's influence. Which statement best describes Wordsworth's legacy? Option A. He revolutionized poetry by emphasizing everyday experience. Wordsworth's concept of the poet was that of option A moral guide and teacher. Wordsworth saw the poet as a moral and philosophical guide for humanity. Wordsworth's works inspired which major environmental movement? Option C, romantic naturalism. His reverence for nature contributed to the romantic naturalist. Wordsworth is considered as founding figure of which literary movement? Option C, Romanticism. He was a leading figure in the English Romantic movement. What was Wordsworth's main contribution to Romanticism? Option C, the celebration of nature and simplicity. Wordsworth emphasized nature as a source of inspiration and wisdom. Which of the following is a key figure of romantic poetry as seen in Wordsworth's works? Option C, emotional intensity and nature worship. Romantic poetry, especially Wordsworth, celebrate emotions and nature. Wordsworth poetry often reflects which romantic ideal? Option C, a deep connection between man and nature. Wordsworth believed that nature and humanity were deeply intertwined. Who is often considered Wordsworth's closest collaborator in the Romantic movement? Option B, Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Coleridge was his closest collaborator, lyrical co-authoring lyrical ballads. Wordsworth's preferences for common people as poetic subjects align with option C, romantic individualism. Wordsworth emphasized common people and individual experience in the poetry. Which of the following best describes Wordsworth's relationship with the French Revolution? Option B, he initially supported it but later rejected its violence. Wordsworth was inspired by the ideals but disillusioned by the reign of terror. How did Wordsworth's romantic philosophy differ from that of Byron and Shelley? Option A, Wordsworth was more conservative and spiritual in his latter years. Unlike Byron and Shelley, he became more conservative over time. The idea that children are closer to divine truth, this truth is central to which of Wordsworth's works. Option C, odd intimations of immortality. The poem explores the idea that childhood is connected to divine wisdom. Wordsworth's later poetry was criticized for being obtuse, lacking option C, lacking in the passion of his early works. Some critics felt his later works were less powerful than his youthful poetry. A recurring motif in Wordsworth poetry is option C, the spiritual renewal through nature. Nature often serves as a restorative force in his poetry. Wordsworth frequently explores the idea of that nature. Option C offers moral and spiritual guidance. Wordsworth viewed nature as a teacher and source of wisdom. The theme of memory and its power to evoke emotions is most evident in which poem? Option B Ode Intimations of Immortality. This poem highlights how memory recalls past emotions. What is the central theme in the prelude? Option B The growth of the poet's mind. The Prelude is an autobiographical poem about Wordsworth's intellectual development. Wordsworth's nature poetry often conveys option a belief in its healing and spiritual power. Nature in his poetry often heals and elevates the human spirit. Which of these aspects is commonly associated with Wordsworth's vision of childhood? Option B Divine purity and wisdom. Wordsworth believed childhood held a special connection to the divine. Wordsworth's poem lines, composed a few miles above Tintin Abbey, explores option B the impact of childhood memories and on adult experience. Tintin Abbey emphasized the influence of past experiences on the present. Wordsworth's approach to religion in his poetry is best described as option B deeply personal and connected to nature. His religious views were personal and often linked to nature's divinity. Wordsworth's later poetry shifted towards themes of option B nostalgia and conservatism. His later poetry became more nostalgic and less revolutionary. What type of solitude does Wordsworth frequently celebrate? Option C Peaceful solitude in nature. Wordsworth valued solitude in nature as a source of inspiration. Which of famously which poet famously criticized Wordsworth for losing his early poetic fire? Option A. Lord Byron. Byron criticized Wordsworth's later poetry as lacking passion. In what way did Coleridge critique Wordsworth's poetry? It was too philosophical and lacked passion. Coleridge felt Wordsworth's poetry sometimes became overly intellectual. Which 20th century literary movement saw a renewed interest in Wordsworth's work? Option D. Eco criticism. Wordsworth's nature centered poetry had influenced ecological studies. Wordsworth's focus on nature has influenced which modern literary movement? Option C. Eco criticism. Wordsworth's nature centered poetry has influenced ecological studies. How has Wordsworth the Prelude been viewed in modern literary studies? Option B. As a groundbreaking autobiographical epic. The Prelude is considered a major work in English autobiographical poetry, which critic called Wordsworth's poetry the poetical interpretations of nature. Option B. Matthew Arnold. Arnold saw Wordsworth's poetry as deeply connected to nature. Wordsworth's influence is often seen in the works of which modern nature poet? Option B. Robert Frost. Frost's nature poetry was influenced by Wordsworth's theme. Wordsworth's contribution to poetry was most strongly defended by which critic? Option B. Harold Bloom. Bloom defended Wordsworth's influence on English poetry. In contemporary literary studies, Wordsworth's work is often analyzed through the lens of option B. Eco-criticism and romantic idealism. Modern critics study Wordsworth's work through ecological and romantic perspective. What is the full title of Tintin Abbey? Option B. Lines composed a few miles above Tintin Abbey. Tintin Abbey was composed during which significant event in Wordsworth's life? Option A. He returns to the Wye Valley after 5 years. Wordsworth revisited the Wye Valley in 1798, reflecting on his past visit and changed perceptions. In which year was Tintin Abbey written? In 1798. The poem was composed in July 1798 during a tour of Wye Valley. Tintin Abbey was first published in which collection? Option B. Lyrical Ballads. Tintin Abbey was first published in Lyrical Ballad 1798, co-authored by Coleridge. Who was Wordsworth's companion during his second visit to the Wye Valley? Option B. His sister Dorothy Wordsworth. Dorothy was with Wordsworth during his second visit, and the poem acknowledges her presence. Tintin Abbey is written in which poetic form? Option A. Blank verse, unrhymed, iambic pentameter. What is the dominant metrical pattern of Tintin Abbey? Option A. Iambic pentameter. Wordsworth employs a natural flowing rhythm typical of blank verse. Tintin Abbey belongs to which poetic tradition? Option C. Romantic lyrical poetry. It is a meditative romantic lyric reflecting personal emotion and philosophy. What kind of the poem is Tintin Abbey? Option A. A meditative poem. The poem is structured as a reflective meditation on nature and memory. How many years had passed since Wordsworth's first visit to the Wye? Option B. 5. Wordsworth states that 5 years had passed since his first visit. This famous line also: nature never did betray the heart that loved her. The sounding contract hunted me like a passion. That's it. I hope you like this video and the wrap up of part 1 of the of our 500 most important MCQ series on Wordsworth. We have explained his life, major works and poetic vision, covering key exams oriented insights. But this is just the beginning. Stay focused. Stay tuned for part 2, where we dive even deeper into his themes, style, and critical perspective. Keep revising and stay focused. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to this channel. See you in the next part. Keep exploring, keep growing. Thank you. Thank you so much again.